Okay, hi everybody. We're going to talk about Chapter 6 in this video. Chapter 6 is going to be a little bit big, just to kind of put it out there. We're going to be talking about a bunch of different things, how people vote, what are some of the situations that people use in their, maybe in their characteristics or their personality to vote. And then we'll talk a little bit about the different types of voting systems here in the U.S. and coupled with talking a little bit about the different parties that have existed throughout history. So let's go ahead and kick this off by talking about elections. And elections give legitimacy to government. Remember, to have a true democracy, you have to have the rule of law, and you also have fair and free elections. Elections, people actually choose policy. I mean, choose people, not policy. So you have to understand that when we look at people, we're going to vote most off of who we personally like more, not necessarily the policy that they're representing. Now, there are people that vote based off of straight policy, but it's kind of hard because we have different types of feelings on different types of issues now. I mean, you could be pro-gay marriage, but you could also be, wanting to lower the national debt. So those are a couple of different ideologies on the political spectrum that are out there. So I think we choose people instead of voting for people based off of policy. And why we vote here in the U.S. and what are the reasons that we vote? Here are a few things that we're going to take a look at. People can vote based off of policy. It doesn't happen often. People vote strict party at times. People vote group benefits. They'll vote retrospectively, and they'll vote based off a candidate's image. And the last two are going to be the most common. So we usually really don't have a situation where people will vote strictly off of policy. Most voters have no information or opinion about many specific policy issues. They can make an inference, but they really don't have concrete evidence because sometimes candidates will make their positions vague. Candidates frequently mistakenly believe they have a policy mandate, but policy positions usually don't bring victory. They're not necessarily bound by their campaign pledges. When we talk about the ideological spectrum, you're going to see that about 36% of the people in the U.S. consider themselves conservative, 25% consider themselves liberal, and 39% consider themselves moderate. So remember that. The moderate population here in the U.S. in the voting is going to be the most important, and we'll explain why in a little bit. We do have a high level of party polarization. I think we've had the highest level of party polarization that we've ever had. And basically what polarization means is the difference between the left and the right. It is about as far apart as it ever has been. So that's what we mean by polarization, kind of the difference in thought between the left and the right. And we've seen, in the past 20 years, it grows farther and farther apart. People at times vote based off of party. Party identification remains a powerful influence after you vote somebody just based off of the party membership. So you're going to vote for somebody just because they're a Democrat, or you're going to vote somebody just because they're a Republican. We also have kind of group demographics, and I'm going to change this one up a little bit, and we'll look at it in a few seconds. But for the most part, Democrats are drawn up of large union members, big city dwellers, Jewish people, and African Americans. Republicans are usually drawn from rural, small town, suburban, Protestant, white business people. Evangelical is another one that we have to throw on top of there. But notice when I was giving kind of that spiel about the groups, I didn't mention Catholics. Now, I was brought up in the Catholic Church. I was brought up in kind of that education system, learning about the Catholic religion and God and all that stuff that it entails. But one thing that you have to kind of understand is that the Catholic religion used to be a staple of the Democratic Party all the way up into the 70s, but they slowly detached themselves and realigned themselves with the Republican Party. The author of the text still says that they're part of the Democratic Party. I really don't agree with that, as I've seen Catholics, been drawn more and more to the Republican Party based off of, some of these maybe social issues that are out there. So, think about that when you're reading this and trying to understand. Sometimes people vote retrospectively, and I think this is a lot of the ways that people well, used as far as coming up with the decision on who to vote for or who not to vote for, right? Sometimes people use retrospective judgment about past political conduct that would tie into their vote. Sometimes voters will hold the incumbent party responsible for hard economic times. A really good illustration of this is if we look at 2008, the rejection of Republican problems, which led to the election of Barack Obama. So, things like war, the economy, maybe race relations can all play into a part on how people might change their vote going from a 4 or 8 year period to another 4 or 8 year period. So what I'm trying to really emphasize is 2008 is a good illustration of that. If you look at some of the problems that we had in 2008, we had an economy and a housing market that really went into the toilet. We had 2 wars that seemed endless. People were kind of tired of the Republican problems that were created, blaming George W. Bush for a lot of our issues. Therefore, I think when people went to the polls on that day in 2008, they decided to try the Democrats as opposed to the Republicans. And that is an issue of voting retrospectively. People also vote based off of a candidate's image. Who seems presidential? What are some of the things that we kind of take into account? Maybe a person that's well-spoken. Maybe it's a person that's attractive. I think we're vain enough in this society to admit that we'll vote based off of a person's attractiveness. But it's basically all likability. If you like that candidate and he sticks out or she sticks out, people might vote just based off of likability. So think about that. The 2 ways that people will vote are retrospectively, trying to figure out or trying to decide who to vote for, where, we might hold the incumbent party responsible for certain actions or certain, things that might be going on in the world that aren't favorable to us. But also based off of a candidate's charm, presence, appeal is another way. When we talk about parties, parties are a huge part of our electorate. If we would look at it from a pluralist point of view, we would have clear policy positions for people in the party. We would educate people about the issues, recruit people for office, and so on. But part of that, we don't have that type of situation going on with our voting. A lot of the times, parties are oligarchies dominated by a few that necessarily may not reflect the whole opinion of voters within that party. Party loyalty has been declining over time. Media has replaced the party as a conduit between the voter and the candidate. So we'll talk a little bit about that in primary elections, which we've been seeing undermine the power of party organizations and party elites. Now let's go ahead and look at some of the periods that we've had here with regards to the developments of parties in the U.S. We're going to kind of go through this a little bit quickly and we won't get too bogged down. There is going to be one political party that I want you to take a look at. It's the third biggest party here in the U.S. right now, called the Libertarian Party. And we'll talk about that when we get to it. But one of the first parties was the Federalist Party, obviously headed by Alexander Hamilton, which favored a strong central national government. The Democratic Republican Party, or anti-federalists, were formed by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They favored more state influence in the federal government as opposed to Hamilton's federal look on the federal side. Also had something called the Era of Good Feeling, where we saw a political history where we had a sense of national purpose and unity during that time after the War of 1812. We have the Anti-Mason Party, which was formed in 1827, which was, we saw the disappearance of William Morgan, who was a Freemason who was planning to publish a book which revealed the secrets of the order. The Masons, the Illuminati, are traditionally organizations that are considered secret, and there's a lot of conspiracy theories that go into those parties that we're really not going to get into. The anti-Mason Party eventually became the Whig Party. And the Whig Party was a presidential party that was formed to oppose President Andrew Jackson and the Democrats. Sought for protective tariffs. Remember, tariffs are taxes on goods that are imported into the country. You tax the country that's trying to send in goods. This is used to kind of, in a sense, generate revenue by kind of encouraging people here in the U.S. to produce that product without, at a cheaper cost than importing it and having to pay a tax on it. The party was ultimately destroyed by the question on whether to allow slavery into the expanding territories. And the voter base defected to the Republican Party. Then after the Civil War, we had Reconstruction. The Republican Party was the opposition to the Democratic Party and the Know-Nothings. We'll talk about that. At that time, the Republican Party slogan was free labor, free land, and free men. But, obviously, not all men were free. The Republican Party supported business to the gold standard, higher tariffs, like I mentioned, to stimulate growth, created programs to subsidize railroads, a new banking system, and also created a welfare state. At this time, sometimes people referred to the parties as Tweedledee and Tweedledum. And the Reeves book talks about this a little bit. When we talk about Tweedledee and Tweedledum, comes from the Alice in Wonderland story, where you had these two goofballs that are different, but they're the same. I guess is the easiest way to illustrate this. But when we use that Tweedledee and Tweedledum argument here in the world of politics, it's not really a feasible analogy because both parties are very different that we have right now. Let's have the Nativist Movement, which, sometimes still exists today. Nativism is a political position where we have to preserve certain established inhabitants of a nation as compared to claims of new immigrants. Trying to limit immigration, trying to control, a sense of nationalism where we have one culture, one language, and restricting immigration. A lot of these nativists were anti-Irish Catholic, anti-German, anti-Chinese, and anti-Mexican. When we see this and we go throughout history, there's always been kind of a demographic group that has been, I don't want to say demonized, but kind of looked down upon. At first, it was the Irish Catholics at the beginning of the whole immigration influx in our country at its origin. Then we had anti-German, anti-Chinese, anti-Mexican, and this is all periods throughout history, and I think we can even now make it seem like it's maybe Latin American, where we don't necessarily see immigration from different we see immigration from different countries, and especially Latin American countries. They're not necessarily illegally immigrating from Mexico. A lot of it is from Latin America, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. So, there's also kind of a look down on some of those individuals as well. We had the Bull Moose Party, which was formed by Teddy Roosevelt. In 1896, realignment centered the Republicans as a party of big business, while adding more small business support by embracing trust-busting or getting rid of those monopolies. This was also called the Progressive Party, right? And we had many progressive reforms, which we talked about in the last week. And as this party kind of dwindled off, they joined FDR's New Deal Party, which was kind of the birth of what we know as the Democrats today. The New Deal coalition was the alignment of interest groups and voting blocks in the U.S. that supported the New Deal. Remember, the New Deal was put into place to help stimulate the economy after the economic hardships that we had and were caused by the Great Depression. So it was a lot of organization amongst city machines, labor unions, blue-collar workers, minorities, white Southerners, people in relief, and intellectuals, which sought to expand government and help build the country's economy through the use of a welfare state along with public policy projects. New Deal programs and FDR's civil rights stance brought many people to this party. It was never officially a party, but evolved into the Democratic Party that we have now. Unfortunately for the Democrats, the forces of the civil rights movement and the hippie counterculture that was starting kind of fractured the party in the northern states. Many blue-collar workers who were conservative disliked the aims of that youth counterculture that we saw, as well as the civil rights movement, and turned them off. We also saw people in the South form something called the Dixiecrats. This was a state rights Democratic Party, which was a short-lived segregation of political party. It was led by a gentleman named Strom Thurmond that we'll talk about. What they wanted to do is they wanted to keep Jim Crow laws and white supremacists in effect. It started in 1948 as a faction of the Democratic Party. Strom Thurmond was a founding member. He ran for president in 1948. He was actually the longest serving senator ever in our U.S. history, where he served from 1953 to 2003 when he was 101 years old. George Wallace, also a person that ran off the Dixiecrat. Former governor of Alabama, ran for president in 68, 72, and 76. An assassination attempt, which is actually detailed in the movie Forrest Gump, if you ever watched that. There's a scene where they show George Wallace being shot. He sought redemption after that because he felt that he finally saw that his views on race were wrong. So the Republicans Party that we see now rose after the New Deal. It was pro-business, supported blacks, the gold standard, railroads, high tariffs to protect factory workers, and growing industry fast through industrialization. As the New Deal Democrat coalition collapsed, we saw a lot of white Democrats, Southern Democrats defect with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, so they defected to the Republican Party, and that's kind of what makes up the parties now. The Republicans won 5 of 6 presidential elections. Ronald Reagan is the party's iconic conservative hero. And from 1992 to 2016, the Republican candidate has been elected to the White House in 3 of 7 presidential elections. And when we talk about what kind of the platform of the Republican Party is, a lot of its strength, a lot of its demographics are mostly socially conservative white evangelical Protestants, as well as traditional Roman Catholics. They have segments of the party as well, the religious right, which is a very strong segment of the Republican Party, these evangelical Christians that are tied into the religion, and the moral majority tied into that. The Tea Party and the Freedom Caucus the Tea Party's kind of died off a bit, but they've also evolved into a part of the Republican Party called the Freedom Caucus that is really against the welfare state and as small as government as possible. Small government, adherence to traditional values, spreading democracy throughout the world, and that supply side economics where you cut taxes at the very top and that money is going to trickle down to the lower earners. We'll talk more about that when we get into public policy. We had the Reform Party that existed in the 90s. It was founded by H. Ross Perot. Perot ran for president in 92, and he received 19% of the popular vote. Didn't win any electoral college votes, but won 19% of the vote. This was a huge, huge number for a third-party candidate. Jesse Ventura, who was a wrestler and an actor, was in the movie Predator, if you ever seen that movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger. So you have 2 former governors in that movie, Jesse Ventura and Arnold Schwarzenegger. Jesse Ventura was elected governor of Minnesota in 1998. This party platform focused on fiscal issues such as reducing the national debt, instituting term limits, campaign finance, lobbying, and issues on trade. The party died off in 2000 when people like Pat Buchanan and David Duke joined the party. At one time, Trump was a member. Pat Buchanan is a very right-wing conservative individual who served in the Nixon administration. is a Holocaust denier. So you can kind of see where he's coming from with regards to his thought. And David Duke, as we know, if you don't know, he was the former leader of the Ku Klux Klan. So, yeah. So we look at demographics. Generally, men are going to be more Republican than women. Whites are going to be more Republican than blacks. Just some demographic information here. This includes leaning. So when I say leaning, that means somebody who might consider themselves an independent, but leans toward the Democratic Party, that maybe agree with a little bit more issues what the Democrats have than the Republicans. That might be considered a person that's leaning. So I kind of consolidated that a bit. So currently we have, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, and third parties here in the United States. The biggest third party is the Libertarian Party. The problem with these parties, the Libertarian Party, Green, and Constitution Party, is they're not on every ballot here in the United States. So each state has their own ballot. The Libertarian Party is only on 37 of the 50 ballots here in the United States. The Green Party is on 22 and the Constitution Party is on 13. The reason these third parties fail is because they're not on every single ballot here in the United States. The Libertarian Party is the most successful minor party here in the U.S., but they fail because they don't have ballot access, so they're not on each single ballot. Here's a little bit of the Republican Party platform. You guys can read that. Democrat, Libertarian. I encourage you guys to look at the Libertarian Party. It's really interesting. The Green. Now, there's a couple of terms that we're going to want to understand here, right? The first one is de-alignment. De-alignment basically means that people are detaching themselves from both parties and becoming independent. So when a party is no longer attractive to you and you de-align yourself from that party and become an independent, that's considered de-alignment. Realignment is a little bit different. Realignment is when a social group of people change the party totally. Remember how I mentioned about those Catholic voters? How they've detached themselves from the Democratic Party and kind of align themselves with the Republican Party. That's an example of realignment. So remember those two terms, de-alignment and realignment, and what they mean. Now, in order to win an election, you have to appeal to the people in the middle. So let's take a look at this. Most of your voters are going to be in the ideological middle, right? So if you are 25% of your population is liberal and you're a liberal candidate wanting to vote or wanting to win an election, you have to move yourselves along the ideological spectrum as close as you can to attract that voter base in the middle. So if you need 51% of the voting populace to vote for you to win, you have to move yourselves along the ideological spectrum just enough to attract those people from the middle without alienating your base or your liberal base. So you have to move yourself along the ideological spectrum closest to the middle as you can to attract those voters, and at the same time to not alienate the people that are part of your base. It's kind of what happened in 2016 where Hillary Clinton lost to Bernie Sanders voters. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but she moved herself too far along the ideological spectrum and lost a lot of voters from the Sanders camp. Okay, we also have something called single-member districts. So the United States is carved up into 435 different districts. Each district represents an individual, elects an individual to represent them. We vote for someone to represent our district. Districts are, like I said, districts are split into the U.S. Primaries, which we've been seeing, the last ones are going to come up here in June. The primaries involve the parties nominating somebody to run for the House of Representatives. And then when we get to November, the top vote getters in each party move on to the general election. And the candidate who receives a plurality of votes will win. And when I say plurality, that simply means people that get the most votes. And we also have direct elections. So here in the United States, it's almost the same as the single-member districts. This involves the elections of senators. The 17th Amendment gives the citizens of the state the right to vote directly for their senator. So in California, the top two vote getters in the primary will go on to face each other in general election no matter what party they belong to. So in 2016, we saw a Senate seat that was eventually won by Kamala Harris. She ran against another Democrat because they were the top two vote getters in the primary. Now, primaries are a little bit... Well, I'm trying to think of the best word. You know, they usually don't meet expectations as far as voter turnout. Primary elections decide the party's nominee for a public office. Usually our turnout is anywhere from 20 to 30%. So 20 to 30% of the population, of the voting population, votes in primaries, which also means 70% don't vote. So it's kind of an interesting stat where you only have 20 to 30% of people deciding who's going to be the candidate that you elect for House of Representatives, Senate, or President. You know, presidential elections, we usually see about a 60% participation rate, which also tells you about 40% of the people aren't voting. You know, when we talk about the presidency, and the presidency is one of the most highly contested as we're seeing right now. Nomination process begin with Iowa in January and a primary in New Hampshire. They provide an opportunity for the media to kind of separate who they believe to be the serious candidates versus the ones that aren't necessarily serious. The book says that political party elites can't control the selection of candidates. I disagree with that. We'll talk about that in a little bit, especially on the Democratic side. So, you know, just because somebody wins an election or a primary election doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be the nominee. So we've kind of transitioned over to talking about the nominee system for president. In Iowa 2016, it was Cruz and Clinton that won. In New Hampshire, it was Trump and Sanders. We're going to come back and look at this link in a little bit. But the Democratic Party for president uses two types of delegates. One is a regular delegate and the other is a super delegate. So total for the nomination, you have to get half of what 4,765 is. Of that 4,765 total delegates, 714 of those are super delegates. And those are individuals that are usually Democratic members of Congress, former governors, former presidents, party leaders, and other elected officials. They don't have to they are not required to indicate preference for a candidate, but their vote counts a little bit more than ours does. So when we are here in California, our delegates are based off of proportional representation. So here, for example, if a candidate wins 40% of a state's votes in the primary election, they'll win 40% of those state delegates. So if I'm running for president here in California and we're in, say, the Democratic primary, and I win 40% of the vote during the primary, I get 40% of the delegates that are offered by the Democrats. And we'll look at those numbers in a little bit. You just need a simple majority. So let's take a look at this real quick. And this is a kind of an important thing to look at. So this is Clinton won 2,807 delegates. Sanders won 1,894. One interesting thing out of these super delegates, remember super delegates are the individuals that vote on their own. But if you look at it, out of those 712, Clinton received 602 superdelegate votes as opposed to Sanders' 48. So, like, remember, the superdelegates are made up of people that are, inside that structure of the Democratic Party that are very involved. So they have their own vote as opposed to all those individuals that might be part of the Democratic Party. So as you can see out of those... it's pretty evident that the elites in the Democratic Party wanted Clinton to be the nominee with the 602 versus the 48. So we switch that around, Bernie Sanders would have probably won the primary election. But if we talk a little bit about Bernie, and some of the things, in 2016, there was accusations that the Democratic National Committee sandbagged the Sanders campaign. And I think, when I start reflecting and looking back at 2020, when I do this, kind of update the slide, I think I might include Sanders being sandbagged in 2020 by the other candidates in the Democratic National Committee. So there was a WikiLeaks hack, where people hacked into the Democratic National Committee server and found emails and released them on WikiLeaks. They found that the DNC was bad-mouthing the Sanders campaign. The CFO of the Democratic National Committee wanted to suggest that Sanders was an atheist. They had emails that that they were conspiring to show the Sanders campaign was unorganized. And then Donna Brazile, who was the head of the DNC at that time, leaked primary debate questions to the Clinton campaign. So, it's like having the answers to the test. Democrats do it a little bit different, right? Democrats rely specifically on delegates. They have few super delegates, and you just need a simple majority. Now, there's a couple of questions. In California, we have open primaries, which is semi-open, and there was a time where they thought you might want to run closed primaries. When you have a closed primary, you can only vote for candidates that belong to the same party as you. In an open primary, you can vote for anybody, and the winners from each political party advance to the general election. So we have a semi-closed here, or a semi-open, however you want to detail it here in California, where we have primaries, but for Senate, we have the primaries open. But when we have vote for president, the primaries closed. So, kind of some interesting things that happen out of the primaries. We actually moved our primary from June to March. And that allows maybe candidates to pay attention a little bit more to California. Because usually by June, the nomination's pretty much well decided. You need big money to win elections. The typical winning campaign for the U.S. Senate can cost over $10 million. For a House seat, it's about $1.5 million. Remember, these are all usually accomplished through donations. And if we look at this, only about 0.5% of the U.S. population will contribute to $200 or more to a presidential campaign. Usually fat cats, which are, big donors like George Soros, the Koch brothers, even though once passed away, the Koch family. Fundraising occupies more of a candidate's time. We have a Supreme Court case called Buckley versus Vallejo. And Buckley versus Vallejo basically says is that if you want to run for office and you want to spend your own money, you can use as much as your own money as you want. So I don't really see a problem with that. We also kind of saw the McCain-Feingold Act, and we talked a little bit about this in the last week, where the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002 set individual contribution limits. It was originally $2,700 in 2016. Now it's $2,800. But if we kind of compare that to corporations can raise as much money as they want through super PACs, and spend as much money as they want to either support a candidate or defeat a candidate. So remember that super PACs are developed to help support a candidate or defeat a candidate. I want you to watch the video from Stephen Colbert that I have posted there that talks a lot about that. Okay, guys, so that's what I got for this chapter. I know it's a lot of information. We'll be coming back and talking about the next week. So if you have any questions, let me know. Thank you.